Calgarians protest high food prices. Federal government places cap on funding for searches of former residential school sites. Postmedia buys up Saltwire papers in Atlantic Canada. Israel and Hezbollah exchange fire after missile kills 12 in the Golan Heights. And Venezuela holds elections. Good morning. It's Monday, July 29th. I'm Nora. Here are your headlines. Some Calgarians took to the streets over this past weekend to protest the ever-rising cost of food and to call for stricter regulations on major grocery chains. The protest follows an antitrust class action settlement involving Loblaw companies, where they were forced to pay $500 million for their role in the bread price fixing scandal from a few years ago. Speaking to CBC's Joey Cheney, the organizer of the rally and chair of the Calgary chapter of the Alberta Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, or ACORN, Maggie Vlodarczyk, said food is, quote, a basic necessity of life, isn't something people should be profiting off of. The organization calls for higher taxes on major grocery chains and a price cap on essential food items like bread, milk, meat, and fresh vegetables. The rally attendees spoke about their struggles to afford food, especially for those with special needs. Gavin Shekelden has celiac disease and says that the high food prices have impacted her financially and her mental health. Quote, lots of stores across this country are increasing grocery prices, and it's not right, especially for low-income Canadians like me. I've been to food banks, but food banks do not have options, especially for people like me who have allergies, unquote, she told CBC. Next, the federal government is being criticized and rebuffed over its decision to cut funding for searches of former residential school sites. The government announced that it would cut the funding for searches from a possible $3 million a year to just $500,000. The funding for the Independent Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites was also cut. The new funding cuts also limit how the money can be used in future searches. The funding won't cover searches in non-recognized residential schools or searches for children taken to residential schools and then later transferred to hospitals, sanatoria, or other institutions. The new rule also limits the use of funding to purchase memorialization efforts, such as buying headstones or putting up fences to protect burial sites. Kimberly Murray, the Independent Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites, has been one of the people who is critical of these cuts. She said this, quote, it's just a continuing process of Canada creating amnesty for itself by pulling the plug on all of these searches, unquote. Next, news from Atlantic Canada. Very bad news. If you like the news, which I personally do, and you listen to this podcast, so you probably like the news too. Well, Postmedia is buying up Saltwire, Atlantic Canada's largest newspaper chain. Saltwire publishes more than 20 regional newspapers, including the Chronicle Herald in Halifax, the Guardian in Charlottetown, and the Telegram in St. John's. In its press release about the acquisition, Postmedia did not make it clear if it would keep all of the papers intact. It said that currently Saltwire's business operations were unstable and that completing the acquisition would, quote, require cooperation from the company's workforce, unquote, according to the CBC article by Kevin Yar and Victoria Walton. Of course, that usually means that the employees have to cooperate by being fired or laid off or whatever. We'll have to see what that does mean, but that will make Canada's newspapers owned by, what is it already? 80% of the newspapers in Canada are owned by Postmedia, and now this will be another 20. Oh my God. Reminder that Postmedia is owned by a Republican man, a Republican hedge fund, and a German insurance company. Moving now to international news, and first to Israel. Fears are heightened about a possible war between Israel and Hezbollah after the two entities have been escalating their attacks over the past weekend. It started with a projectile that killed 12 children and injured 30 others, all from the Druze community in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Israel occupied the Golan Heights from Syria in the 1967 war and then later annexed it in 1981. Initially, Israel blamed Hezbollah for the attack, but Hezbollah has denied their involvement. According to Al Jazeera, some reports suggested that the object might have been an Israeli anti-rocket interceptor projectile. Following that attack, there were calls from several Israeli officials for retaliatory attacks against Hezbollah, echoing months of calls for an all-out war. IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi said Israel was, quote, greatly increasing our readiness for the next stage of fighting in the north, as we are simultaneously fighting in Gaza, unquote. Israel did launch several airstrikes against several Hezbollah-owned weapons depots and infrastructure, though these attacks are in line with what have been happening over the past few months since October 7th. Analysts have warned for months that a miscalculation on either side can result in an all-out war. Hezbollah has said that they will continue their attacks in solidarity with Gaza until a ceasefire agreement is reached. The results could have a rippling impact if the incumbent president, Nicolas Maduro, who's been in power for 11 years, loses. Maduro faces intense competition from Edmundo Gonzalez, a former diplomat who took over as the opposition leader after Maria Corina Machado was banned from running. Some polls showed Gonzalez in the lead ahead of voting. Concerns about fairness in the elections have arisen since Maduro banned most independent electoral observers. Despite this, he said that he will recognize the results of the weekend's elections. Venezuela has been facing a deep economic crisis of varying severity since 2005, largely as a result of U.S.-led sanctions. Anthony Blinken said that the U.S. would not, quote, prejudice the outcome, unquote, of the election, and that, quote, this is a choice for Venezuelans to make, but the Venezuelan people deserve an election that genuinely reflects their will, free from any manipulation, unquote. And Blinken probably knows a lot about that. Those are your headlines for Monday, July 29th. I'm Nora. You're listening to this podcast at sandynora.com, on the Real News Network podcast feed, and anywhere you get your podcasts. I hope you're staring down a wonderful week. I know I am. I will talk to you tomorrow.